Good morning. Okay. Effective communication on the social web. Many of you are probably familiar with Zig Ziglar's famous phrase that people generally buy on emotion and justify with logic. So what I want to talk about this morning is how specifically that phrase relates to how we behave when we use the social web or social media. And to help illustrate that point, I'm going to tell a little story about a new salesperson, a salesperson that is up and coming, just learning his craft, and his name is Maximilian. And for those of you that may know, Maximilian is my 9-year-old son, and boy is he good. So I'll give you an example. If those of you that know the attention span of 9-year-old boys, it tends to be a little short, right? We have a room full of 200 salespeople. I would imagine that some of you might be able to relate to short attention spans, perhaps, right? So in my house, Monday through Thursday is a constant spelling bee. My son gets his spelling words on Monday, he has his test on Friday, and throughout the week my wife is throwing words at him left and right. Spell this, spell that. And he's trained, he knows by Thursday he better be able to spit them out all correctly. So Thursday evening comes, final round of tests. And my wife is asking my son how to spell his spelling words, and she comes across and she says, "Max, how do you spell beautiful?" And my son, the salesperson he will be, looks up at my wife and says, "M-O-M-M-Y." So she is obviously, warm heart, gushing, "Oh, we have such a great son, he's fantastic," right? So it wears off for a second, and then she says, "Max, how do you spell beautiful?" And he proceeds to spell it properly. So she comes out, of course, she can't wait to tell me how this happened. So she tells me the story, and she's gushing, she's talking about how great it was. And I'm thinking, boy, that kid's going to be a great salesman. I mean, he just nailed it. And here's why. Let's look at what he used. He used both emotion, and logic to make his point. He hit home with that mommy line was just a classic. And he came up with it all on his own. But he backed it up with logic. He was able to actually deliver and spell the word properly. So let's think about if he only used one of those two things. If he only either used emotion, which means he only spelled mommy. But then ultimately when she said, "Well, how do you spell beautiful?" For real, he spelled it wrong. Would that have been okay? He probably would have bought himself enough time with the smooth talker line. But it probably in the end, it would have, that warmness would have worn off pretty quickly. On the opposite side, what if he didn't use the mommy line and he just spelled beautiful correctly? Would that have been acceptable? It probably would have been acceptable, but it wouldn't have been remarkable. So what we're talking about really is trying to combine both of these two things together. When both of these two things happen, both emotion and logic, we're able to make a lasting impression, something that people actually remember, something that triggers themselves and creates a lasting relationship. So let's try to relate this activity, buying on emotion and justifying with logic, to how people behave on the web. And if we compare that, think about the fact that when people act on the social web especially, that they buy on emotion, but they transact with logic. And when I say transact, I mean actually pull out the credit card, type in the number, and buy something. When you use the word buy, it doesn't actually mean purchase. Most of the time people have mentally purchased something or mentally bought something before they've transacted to buy it. So using what we know about that, let's think about how people behave in the social space. How many people, and I would imagine that a good majority of you have Facebook accounts, right? Okay, so how many of you go to Facebook to buy stuff? That's what I thought, right? And you just don't. You're not in a transactional state of mind. The fact is that when consumers participate in the social web, they are rarely in a transactional state of mind, if ever. So our messages should not be transactional in nature. Almost never. Doesn't really make sense. It's out of place for the consumer to see that. So what we're looking to do when we talk about social marketing is we're looking to develop interactions, not transactions. What I mean by that, traditional marketing, the goal of course is lead conversion. We're looking to push someone towards an event. We have a message, we push it out to consumers, we're looking to push them in that direction. What we're talking about with the social web is lead curation. And when I say lead curation, I mean creating an environment that is conducive for growing connections into prospects. We're talking about creating an environment that is conducive to growing connections into prospects. So the goal is instead of pushing someone towards the event, pushing them towards the transaction, we're looking to have a two-way conversation with them. We're expecting that we're going to approach them in a very social manner because that's exactly how they're behaving. They're in the social space, they're behaving in an emotional manner. Hitting them with a transactional message will be completely out of place. So we're looking to develop a relationship, and then ultimately we're looking for that individual to move towards the transaction. Now, does that happen with every single person that you build a relationship with? Of course not. I would imagine that there are many of you people, many of us here in the room that have relationships with others, and they may be business relationships that have yet to result in any actual kind of business. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we value those any less. So a lot of people, when they look at this scenario, will say to me, well, I don't really want to do this part. I don't want to have relationships with people. I just want them to call me when they're ready to buy, and then I'll show them a house and they'll buy it. So yes, that would be fantastic if we could spend all of our time on lead conversion. But the fact is, I think most of us would recognize that there's simply not enough people beating down your door right now to buy a new home. So what we are looking to do is to build an environment that helps generate leads for ourselves. And I'll be honest, it's really not up to us. When we think about the shift in consumer behavior, especially over the last 5 years, there has been a tremendous change in how people use the internet. Let's think about how they used it 10 years ago and how it's changed transaction. Do you think the small bookstore owner had any say 10 years ago and said, I don't care if people want to buy books online? And then Amazon.com came along and solved that need. So the fact of the matter is, it really doesn't matter what the business wants. This is a consumer-driven change. So knowing what we know now, we have to understand the fact that consumers are looking for more than simply the transaction. We go back to buying on emotion and justifying with logic, transacting with logic. The fact is that unless you have the ability to add some additional value beyond the process itself, beyond the transaction, you've essentially made yourself really a transaction facilitator. So if you're not adding value beyond the purchase of the home or beyond that process, you are replaceable. You are a commodity. And nobody likes to be a commodity, right? If you are a commodity, then that means the only thing you have to compete on is price. Does anybody like to compete on price? Of course not, right? Somebody can always be $100 less. Somebody can lower their price. Somebody can change their commission. Somebody can do any of these things. So instead, the more effective route is to try to connect on an emotional level. So how do we do that? Now we know what we need to do. Let's talk about some specific examples or specific ways that we could accomplish that. First, I just want to address one typical concern. And most people, I shouldn't say most, but it's a reasonably common question. People will say, well, I'm not really good with social media because I'm not a geek. I don't really get technology. Does it help to be a geek? Absolutely. I can tell you it helps to be a geek as a card-carrying member of the Geek Club. But it is not a requirement to be a geek. Social media is absolutely 80% you and 20% technology. When I say that, I mean most businesses will approach social media and they'll say, okay, how can I use Facebook to reach more consumers? And that's not a bad question, but it's a little cart before the horse. Really, the question is, what do my potential prospects want to hear from me? What can I communicate to my potential prospects that will make them more likely to do business with me? Once you have that answer, then the question becomes, what technologies do I use to distribute that information? What are the best routes? So it absolutely positively starts with the message, technology is secondary. You need to have a customer strategy, not just a social media strategy.